whenever people say Shasta Lake or Oroville Lake, I go reservoirs. God makes lakes, man makes reservoirs. So the point of the Delavan pipeline is to allow both diversion from the river to fill the reservoir, and it be the release pipeline to release water from the reservoir. And you know how much water they'd store in sites, that's water they would, you know, today pump out of the delta. We just don't know until they tell us. Those sites, the sites project involves like 3 reservoirs, one large one behind this ridge, and then a couple of smaller ones that are sort of re-regulating reservoirs to pump water up into the reservoir and release water down. And one of the smaller reservoirs just on the other side of this little ridge. It's called the Funnels. If the project were built and the reservoir full, we'd be about 260 feet underwater here.
How big is the forebay?
Biggest size, the reservoir and facility footprint is a bit over 15,000 acres. So about 15,000 acres of land like this would be developed. Yeah, parts of the structure. Preliminary administrative draft EIR is incomplete, but there are some little nuggets of information in it. One of them is DWR admits that a significant and unavoidable impact would be on federally protected gold eagles, which are common in here. And then there'd be potentially significant unavoidable impacts on a bunch of other species, including a loggerhead shrike, which has got to be my favorite bird. It sounds like a mean-ass bird. And a bunch of other bird species. There's also one federally listed rare plant that would be lost here, and one plant recommended by the Native Plant Society for federal protection. Fish and Wildlife Service is always way behind on listings, and up to 8 other rare plant species that could be impacted that aren't eligible for federal protection at this point. If you come here in August, it really does seem like a great place for a reservoir, because right now you look around, it's lush grass, it's beautiful, it's green. Come here in August, this place is grazed down to bare earth. It just looks like it's been nuked. And I think that's because the ranching families who own this property struggle like a lot of other ranching families do, and they don't have a whole lot of options. So, you know, that's why most of them support sites, because they're going to get bought out and they're going to be fat and happy. We were hoping to have a local named Bob Alvernez on this trip. He lives in Calusa and owns property up in these hills right up here. He has an interesting story. He owned ranch land and farmland in the Santa Clara Valley and kind of got chased out of there by all the development in Santa Clara. Moved up here thinking, oh geez, I'll never have to worry about that again. And guess what? Yep. But he couldn't make it.
There's also a graveyard. All the graves would have to be moved. All the bodies and human remain would have to be taken out, which is an interesting part of the story, right? When you get ready.
Is that it over there?
Yep. And most of the people here, like Steve said, are for Sites Reservoir because they get paid market value, and they feel like it's their, you know, it's their contribution to the state's water problem. One of the big things with Sites Reservoir, though, when you look at this valley, is it's the last place we can build a reservoir, right? There's 1,400 named dams in California. There's over 30,000 dams in California, from small spring dams all the way up to the big name dams. We have harvested all of the low-hanging fruit in terms of places where you can put up a dam and get some water. This has no recharge stream. You can see this little drainage basically from the east side of these hills. But this isn't going to be filled by a stream, which is why it's called North of Delta Off-Stream Storage Project. It's basically a storage pond where we would bring the water in pump it all the way over, and then pump it up and over these hills into the reservoir to fill it. They claim that with those flows that Steve was talking about, they could fill it in 3 to 5 years if they got the right flows. And then they'd operate it basically at that approximately 500,000 acre feet of water per year. When you look at that, it's a pretty flashy system, so the recreational benefits are definitely kind of in question, right? When it'd be recreation right now, right after they filled it in the winter, but then when the summertime hits and everyone that wants to go take a cool dip in the hot summer, they're going to drop that significantly to try to get that flow out in the summertime. So when you're dropping a third of a reservoir every year, up, down, you don't get those same kind of recreational benefits. And so we really just need to get the EIR so that we can actually review this project. Thad Bettner, he's the general manager of Glen Colusa Irrigation District. 2 years ago when he spoke to the Water Commission, he said that he did not want to have the FERC relicensing element, so he didn't want to have power generation. So one of the proposed projects is to have the 1.87 million acre foot storage, where they'd use a lot of energy to pump it up and into the valley, and then they would gain energy when they release it, right?
But it'd still be a net loss.
It would still be a net loss.
What does that say?
The main reason they don't want to have that energy capacity is then you get FERC involved and you get the federal regulators involved in that licensing process. So there's just a ton of questions left on the table with regard to this reservoir, and we do think there are better options and better ways to spend our money. But it's just such a beautiful place too. The Sacramento River Valley red fox is another species that's being studied now. Actually a native species that's been recommended to be studied and possibly listed in the Sacramento Valley. And this is just, it's pristine habitat for the golden eagles and for those things. And the ranching here is a part of our way of life. And if we're not going to get a big benefit in terms of water for Northern California farms, and we're not really sure how the benefits are going to be for the salmon and all those things, the operation, those take-homes that we've been talking about, there is no for sure project. We don't have an environmental impact. We don't have a feasibility study, and the impacts to the river are unknown. And
Really, wouldn't it be more like Folsom or New Melones that goes from 100 down to like 10%?
And then people would bitch. They'd go,
yeah.
"Oh my God, we were promised to be able to use this boat ramp." And it's like, well, no, it's a reservoir. It's actually, its main purpose is to store water and release it. You know, when that means you can't access your boat ramp, that's the way it goes. But it automatically sort of creates an interest group that lobbies for, you know, retaining the water levels in the reservoir.
Are there any estimates on the evaporation rate?
Yeah, DWR estimated that they lose about 7%, 30,000 acre feet a year. And a couple other things. As I mentioned, as you drive through that canyon, you cross the bridge, that's just about where one of the two major dam sites will be. It's also a major fault zone right there. In fact, this whole low range of hills here was created by a fault system, a valley fault zone. It goes all the way from basically the Tehachapi's to Red Bluff. And every once in a while that fault zone kicks off in a spectacular manner. In the late 1800s, wiped out the town of Winters, 8.7 or something like that. That was huge.
Not nice.
Yeah, probably. It was big though. And that's why if you go to Winters, there isn't any buildings that are older than 1890 something. And Coalinga, which was more recent, which, you know, millions of dollars of damage. There's this thing called reservoir-induced seismicity, which is you take an area that's like this, and then all of a sudden you put millions of tons of water weight on it, and it tends to make the fault system shift. And it usually shifts once or twice, and that's done, but not always. And it doesn't necessarily make an earthquake fault that is active. It just sort of speeds up the timing of when an active fault will react. But there are examples where repeated filling and draining and filling and draining of reservoirs kick off reservoir-induced seismic events on a continual basis. So DWR, in the issue of reservoir-induced seismicity, says, well, that's generally associated with much deeper reservoirs, and it just happens when you first fill it.
I think a good example of what you're saying is Anderson Reservoir, where we used to live in Morgan Hill. There was a big earthquake there in 1984, and they've had repeated earthquakes.
Yeah.
And the reason that they drained it just a couple of years ago to do repairs on the dam is the sides are crumbling. They're just falling apart.
Well, they have to, you know, one of the alternative surface storage projects that we would be less concerned about, although there's still probably issues, but that could replace this, because they have to do work anyway, is San Luis Dam, which is the second largest reservoir in California. And they have to do major work in San Luis anyway because of seismic concerns.
Where's that?
In the San Joaquin Valley.
Pacheco Pass?
Yeah.
South of Morgan Hill and Gilroy.
Santanella?
Yeah, that fake mission town.
Yeah.
But, you know, again, it's an issue of real facts. It's like, okay, the Bureau says it's not likely a problem, but if you look through, you know, you Google reservoir-induced seismicity, you'll find out there's a very shallow reservoir in South Carolina called Monticello that's used for pump storage, only 90 feet deep, and it's had a series of seismic events ongoing for reservoir-induced seismic because they fill it up and they drain it, fill it up and they drain it, and that's kind of like what they're going to be doing here. So they can't, you know, the level of scrutiny is lacking.
I've heard some discussion about the temperature of water that released from this reservoir. Can you talk about that?
So we brought that up, and again, in the preliminary document that's available, DWR poo-poos water quality issues, and there's a couple of them. One is temperature. This is a very shallow reservoir. It's a very, you know, particularly hot part of the Sacramento Valley for whatever reason. It just, so the water released from here is going to be pretty warm. DWR claims there'll be a less than 1% shift in temperature of the water that they drain from sites back into the river for delivery.
So there's all this EIR, EIS stuff, but I'm just thinking about the financials. All the big dams have either been subsidized by the poor old taxpayer. The Central Valley Project, State Project, was all California taxpayers. Can anyone do a project like this other than the taxpayers? I mean, if they really make the beneficiaries pay, is Westland's going to come up with a couple billion? No. So once again, if it's a case of it costs the taxpayers $1,500 an acre foot, and then we sell it for $100, it's just another ripoff.
Right, and one of the big issues is that almost half the cost of these projects theoretically are going to be for environmental benefits. And if the environmental benefits are largely a charade, which they certainly are for Shasta and Temperance Flat,
Right.
you know, then we are getting ripped off, basically. You know, I'm willing to concede there could be environmental benefits from this reservoir, but since we don't know what they are yet, I think we have to be very careful. But it is, you know, all of a sudden we shifted. We're not going to build dams to supply water for, you know, agriculture. We're going to build dams to help the environment, which is kind of an oxymoron because dams created many of the environmental problems.
I've heard some proponents argue that with this reservoir, you could release water for deliveries to ag or whomever when the river temperature was not critical for fish, and save the colder water in Shasta for those times of the year when the fish need the colder water.
They said similar things about New Orleans. Right. That it was going to be good for the fish.
And that's a political problem. Every time you read that the Republican House of Representatives has passed a bill saying, turn on the pumps, screw the biological opinions, we don't care about the health smell. Every time Dianne Feinstein, you know, writes a letter to the Bureau saying maximize pumping, that's weakening our environmental laws, whether she admits it or not. So, you know, the agencies that operate these dams are susceptible to political pressure, and time and again they've been operated in a way that it's harmed the environment to maximize water contract deliveries. Yes?
So if this is going to be a at least quasi-government project, is there any way to force them to look at alternatives like a big groundwater bank?
Well, theoretically, NEPA and CEQA both require a look at real alternatives.
Yeah.
That usually requires a lawsuit. We have been prepared as Sacramento Trust for other groups to sue on the Shasta Dam raise because they finalized their EIS and feasibility reports. But the problem is that the Shasta Dam EIS is what they're calling a legislative EIS. It takes an act of Congress. There's an issue we filed today. There's a potential that a federal judge would say this is not right.
One of the cool things in that study from Shasta Dam raises, in their own study, they found it to be non-economically feasible. So that was, the dollars don't add up to actually go for the project, but sometimes.
Never stopped them before.
And the Fish and Wildlife Service said,
yeah.
okay, 60% of the benefits of Shasta are providing cold water for salmon, and we think the salmon benefits from Shasta rays are negative. So you have one agency who has regulatory responsibility for salmon telling another agency, no, this is not correct. So,
Ground storage being a funded alternative.
well, that's the problem because we've set up Prop 1, and Prop 1 says you have to fund projects by the end of 2017. So, and there are no groundwater storage projects even queued up, much less in the process of water review right now. Whereas these projects, they've been sort of slowly grinding through the environmental review process for years. And DWR says they'll put out an EIR on this project tomorrow. Someone says they'll help pay for it.
I looked on the CWC website sometime ago where they had a presentation on scoping for the water storage investment plan, and there were actually a lot of proposals for groundwater storage, but the total dollars for them were peanuts compared to the dollars. So, one, we'd love it if there were enough of those that you could spend all the money on those and we wouldn't be building surface storage. But the other thing is, my understanding is that a lot of these small projects, it's just more difficult for them to meet all of the requirements of a proposal than actually building a project. And I know there is some efforts, there's some business group that sent a letter to the CWC saying, hey,
That's the California Water Commission.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Saying in this rulemaking process, you should be flexible to allow these small groundwater recharge projects to be able to compete.
So there's an interesting, if you Google, I'm trying to think of the keywords, Tulare Basin, Tulare Lake recharge, there's an interesting YouTube video. Someone said, the whole idea of the Temperance Flat Dam on the San Joaquin River is capture this occasional flood flow. It doesn't happen very often, but does occur. And some people said, well, California's second largest freshwater lake used to be Tulare Lake. And at times when the San Joaquin River was overflowing, it actually overflowed into Tulare Lake. And there's existing canal infrastructure that connects the lower San Joaquin to Tulare Lake Basin. And, people were saying, why can't we just, instead of building a new dam on the river, let those flood flows buy up some cotton fields we don't need anyway in Tulare Lake Basin and establish the lake. It would recharge the depleted groundwater basin. It wouldn't require dams. It wouldn't destroy it. It would use almost entirely existing facilities. Seems like it makes a lot of sense, but because there's no agency pushing it, there's no money for it. So, a lot of regulatory stuff that needs to be done hasn't been done.
Right now, it's fine. very much.
Pretty good. 1, 2,